Welcome to the Gladden Longevity Podcast with Dr. Jeffrey Gladden, where our passion is helping you become an age hacker. On this show, we want to help you optimize your life, energy, longevity, health, and human performance with impactful and actionable information by answering 4 questions. How good can we be? How do we make 100 the new 30? How do we live well beyond 120? And how do we live young for a lifetime? I'm Steve Reiter, and Dr. Gladden, back by popular demand, we are doing another question and answer with you.
Oh, okay. Good. I love this.
So this month, apparently, my co-producer, Leo, sent me a note that this month, March, is National Kidney Month. And so we figured now is a good time to talk about kidney health, detoxing, that kind of stuff.
Sure. Yeah. No, it's a subject near and dear to me, as I think the listener knows.
Yeah, for those that may have not heard you talk about this, you had some kidney problems when you were a kid.
Yeah, I did. I was 5 years old. I remember it really quite well. I had a strep throat, and then I just stopped making urine, actually.
What?
Yeah, my kidneys just kind of shut down. And then the urine turned really dark brown and it was really funky. And I was at home. I remember going to the doctor. I remember being told to go to bed rest. So I actually stayed in bed for 2 weeks and, kind of just sipped on some liquids and some stuff like that. And after about 2 weeks, I started to, make urine again. But what happened was the antibodies to the strep bacteria attacked my kidneys. It's called post-strep glomerulonephritis.
How common is that?
That's a good question. I don't know what the actual percentage is. It's not like super common, but it's also not terribly rare. So,
Yeah. Okay.
So anyway, the kidneys were damaged and I just carried on my life as normal growing up. I didn't really know they were damaged until I started having some blood tests done later and then saw that my serum creatinine was a little bit elevated. So there's a couple things that you should know. There's a couple routine tests that are used to measure kidney function. One is serum creatinine. It's different than creatine that people take to before they work out, right? But serum creatinine is basically a metabolite of muscle. And so the more muscle mass you have, the higher your creatinine levels are. And this actually varies between races. So,
really?
Yeah, and sexes, races, sexes, and ages. And so people of African, I guess we're all from African descent, but people that are more recently of African descent basically have more muscle mass and tend to run higher creatinines. As people age and their muscle mass is lost, which, hopefully doing the things that we're talking about here is not happening for you, but people that are just following the trajectory of aging, their muscle mass goes down, their creatinine levels go down. So it's a muscle mass dependent indicator of kidney function, which means it's somewhat fallible. The other one is BUN, blood urea nitrogen, which basically has to do with the concentration of amino acid metabolites in the blood, protein in your diet. And so you can run a higher BUN based on decreased kidney filtration function, and you can run a higher creatinine based on decreased kidney filtration function. And you can also run a higher BUN and to some extent creatinine, but the BUN seems to be affected more if you're dehydrated. So you can look at somebody's labs and see that if you've seen them in person and know what their muscle mass is, you can get an idea of, what's the creatinine telling you? Were they dehydrated? Were they not dehydrated when the labs were drawn? A lot of people are fasting when they have labs drawn and they can become dehydrated. Yeah. So typically you actually want to drink water while you're fasting before labs so that you don't end up dehydrated. So anyway, those are 2 very common things. There's 2 others. One is cystatin C. And cystatin C is another marker of kidney filtration function. And it is not muscle mass dependent. So it's muscle mass independent, which means that you could measure it in anybody, regardless of their age, sex, size, race. And it's just a true read on kidney function. So we actually look at that on all our clients in addition to the creatinine and BUN.
What exactly is that test doing and measuring? And
it's just measuring a molecule that's filtered by the kidney's predetermined rate, right? So if the rate of filtration goes down, we should probably mention that, I use the term glomerulonephritis. Well, what's a glomerulus, right? A glomerulus is basically the filtration unit of the kidney. So blood flows to the kidney Blood goes through the glomerulus where it's separated out. Urine is separated out. The blood is filtered, and the urine, which contains urea, BUN, some creatinine, and all these other things, gets filtered out of the blood. Toxins get filtered out this way. And then the blood basically reconstitutes as blood and comes back out of the kidney, right? So you're losing some volume. And you know that if you drink a lot of water, you've got to urinate more, right? Because the kidney is responsible for fluid control in the body, in conjunction with a couple of other hormones from the adrenal glands, but it controls volume that way. So that's kind of how it works. And the last thing I was going to mention for measuring is protein in the urine, right? So when the glomerula have been damaged, they don't have the same integrity to keep protein in the blood and filter out toxins and urea and things like that into the urine. They're a little sloppy in their job when they've been damaged, right? So you can either have microscopic amounts of protein in the urine, which can be an indicator of kidney function, but also in microscopic amounts, it's also an indicator of the permeability of the blood vessels that are feeding blood into the kidney. So It's also an indicator of vascular inflammation, if you will.
Really?
Yeah, it's a tool that we use to look at early stages of heart disease for people. Do they have microscopic amounts of protein leaking into the urine? If they have, larger amounts, the kind that would be picked up typically with you've seen a doctor, you've gone and you've given a urine sample, you've seen them stick a dipstick into it, right? And it's measuring the levels of certain things like protein and ketones and blood sugar or, sugar in the urine, things like that. pH, how acidic or how alkaline is the urine. Anyway, if you're picking up protein on a dipstick, that's a much cruder method to detect protein. And so you typically have more protein. So if you have kidney issues and you see a kidney physician, a nephrologist, and they're going to basically want to do a 24-hour urine collection where they can collect your urine for 24 hours, measure how much creatinine is in there, what the volume of it is, and how much protein's in there. And that becomes really kind of the gold standard test for determining kidney function. Mm-hmm. So these other tests are sort of spot tests like a BUN and creatinine or a cystatin C or, that kind of thing are more approximate measures of what's happening. There are some other esoteric markers, but I don't think we need to go into those right now.
Yeah.
SDMA and some other things, but that's a little bit beyond the scope of this conversation.
So what have you done because you had this kidney damage? Mm-hmm. What have you done and what are you doing to improve? Have you been able to improve your kidneys? Or is it like a cap in terms of how much you can improve them?
Yeah, I think, ultimately for me, I think the goal is probably to regenerate them at some point. Now, I had a acute cholecystitis about 10 years ago.
And what is that?
That's basically an inflamed gallbladder.
Okay.
So people get appendicitis. Everybody's heard of appendicitis. The appendix gets inflamed. Can happen for a variety of reasons. Well, in my case, my gallbladder got inflamed, but not because I had gallstones. It got inflamed from an infection the same way that the appendix would get inflamed from an infection.
Yeah. And
initially I thought I had the flu. So I was taking some flu medications and staying in bed and stuff. And I was sick. I mean, this is probably the sickest I've ever been as an adult.
Wow.
And, my fever was going way up. It would go up. For adults to get a temperature over 103 is a pretty high temperature, right? Kids will get up to 104, 105. But for an adult to go, 103.5 or whatever, that's a high temperature. And I had a thermometer, so I knew my temperature was going up that high. And I'll tell you a funny story. What happened was that when my temperature would go that high, I would literally start praying, God, just take me. I'm ready to go. Just
really?
Yeah, I can't tolerate this. It's over. Just please take me. This is so uncomfortable, right? And then when my fever would drop down to about 100.5, it'd be like, oh, I wonder what's for lunch, right? So it was really kind of interesting to see just how our minds kind of respond to that kind of physiology, But anyway, I was quite sick. I was misdiagnosed initially when I went in to get checked. They thought I had the flu too. And then I wasn't getting better. And I had to go back and I went to the emergency room and then they admitted me and then they found out this out. And then I had a laparoscopic surgical procedure to remove the gallbladder, which, I have no scars from, which is really quite remarkable, right? They kind of, they went in through the belly button and you can't find a scar. So anyway, it's pretty interesting, but they took out my gallbladder And then that creates another set of issues for me in that I can't absorb fats appropriately, right? So I need to take a supplement that kind of mimics bile acids that will emulsify fats whenever I eat fats or take vitamins that are fat soluble, like vitamin D and fish oil and things like that, right? Vitamin E, vitamin K. So, it was in the context of that gallbladder that I had a CT scan of the abdomen done. And in there, they showed that my left kidney was shrunken down, that it had definitely been damaged and was scarred. The right kidney actually looked pretty good, but the left kidney didn't look so good, right? So that was like the first kind of anatomic information I had about 10 years ago about what things look like. Prior to that, I knew that my creatinine ran a bit high. It should run 1.1 or less, 1.2 or less, if you're pretty muscular. Mine was running like 1.4, 1.5. At one point, it got up to 2.1. And then I started doing a bunch of things and got it back down to about 1.4. And right now, it bounces around between about 1.3 and 1.5, depending on when I test it. But it's been stable for over a decade. And, that's good news because the natural trajectory would be for it to go downhill over time.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah.
So what are the kinds of things that you are doing then to help your kidneys? And what kinds of things do you recommend for your patients normally that, are coming to you and you're like, oh yeah, we definitely need to be taking care of your kidneys?
Yeah. Well, I think it's like anything, the first thing is what are you putting in that you should take out, right? So what are the things that can damage your kidneys? So, foods that are higher in phosphorus, it turns out, are hard on kidneys.
What kinds of foods are those?
Things like sardines are pretty high in phosphorus, interesting enough. Yeah. And there's some other vegetables that can be pretty high. I'd have to look them up exactly. I don't have the list right in front of me, but foods that are high in phosphorus, anybody could Google that, just see foods that are high in phosphorus. And then things that are high in potassium. Now, I don't really have a problem. My kidneys are not bad to the sense where I'm worried about going on dialysis or anything, but people that have kidneys that are worse than me have to really be careful around things like salt and potassium and things like that, right? I don't really have that issue per se. So they're avoiding foods that are rich in potassium, like potatoes or bananas or tomatoes or things like that, or even oranges and stuff like that can be a problem. Or avoiding salty foods and salted foods, right? Getting too much salt can be a problem. People run high blood pressures when their kidneys aren't working. My blood pressure is actually great. I mean, it's like 108/70, right? So
I could imagine with all the exercise that you're doing.
Yeah. So to answer your question, it's about avoiding things that are going to be a stress for the kidney. Now, another thing that's hard on kidneys is a high protein diet. So I'm not a massive fan of, carnivore diets and high protein this and high protein that. And there's a reason for that because number one, when you're eating a lot of protein, you're activating mTOR all the time. And mTOR builds muscle and builds bone and things like that. But it also increases your risk for cancer and also increases your risk for kidney disease. And you also live a shorter life. So I'm not a big fan of high protein diets for that reason. But in my case, a high protein diet is putting a load on the kidneys, right? And if I'm losing protein, then I'm leaking protein out. It puts a bigger kind of metabolic load on the kidneys. So I don't eat meat every day. I don't eat animal protein every day. And I've become really fond of perfect aminos, right? This is maybe a product we've talked about. I don't think we've done a show on it, but it's an amino acid compilation that was put together by a physician, Dr. Minkoff in Florida, who happens to be an Ironman. And I don't know how many Ironman races he's run. He's in his 70s now. I don't know if he's still doing them. But he put together an amino acid formulation that has all the essential amino acids in a combination that the body utilizes in very, very high percentage to make actual protein. So, people are on a high protein diet because, if I eat a lot of protein, I'm going to build a lot of muscle. Okay, well, let's examine that hypothesis. So if you're eating egg whites, right, which is the most biologically active protein you can get a hold of, the most biologically complete and available protein you can eat, well, what percentage of an egg white goes in to making protein in your body, right? It's about 48 or 49%.
Really?
Yeah. The rest of it gets metabolized. Protein can become carbohydrate, right? Fat cannot become protein and fat cannot become carbohydrate. Carbohydrate can become fat, but protein can also become carbohydrate. A lot of people don't actually realize the biochemical links there. So when you're eating tons of protein, you're still getting carbs, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
And people think they're not, but they sort of are. And if you're eating a low quality protein like collagen, only about 22% of it goes into making protein. Now, collagen's unique in that it stimulates collagen production in the body when the body's exposed to collagen. So it has a little bit of a interesting interplay there with joints and skin and things like that. So taking some collagen can be appropriate. But if you're taking branched chain amino acids because you want to build protein, right, only about 6% of that goes into protein. So with the perfect aminos, 98 to 99% of the amino acids go into building protein. So I like that because I don't have to eat a lot of protein, and yet I can make a lot of protein. Mm-hmm. And so for my kidneys, that's a really nice way to approach it.
So at what point does detoxification come into play in helping kidney health?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to notice that the kidneys are metabolically sensitive. In some respects, they're kind of a fragile organ. The inside of the kidney, it's made up of nephrons, and inside the nephrons are these glomeruli, which are basically the actual filtration units, right? What's actually doing the filtering. It turns out that they're very sensitive to oxidative stress. And so when I was practicing interventional cardiology, and we would take somebody to the cardiac catheterization laboratory, we would be injecting a contrast agent, an iodine-laden contrast agent, because the iodine was a heavy enough atom that it would show up under X-ray. So if we shoot contrast that has iodine in it down your coronary artery, and we put X-ray over the artery while we're doing that, we get a silhouette of the artery, and we could see to some extent what was happening in the artery, right?
Yeah.
But it turns out that contrast creates a big load on the kidneys, right? Because that contrast has to get out of your body. And how does it get out? Well, it gets out through your kidneys.
Yeah.
And so as that's going out, it's actually increasing oxidative stress in that metabolically sensitive portion of the kidney, the medullary portion of the kidney. It's called the middle portion of the kidney. And so we went to great lengths to actually protect people from that contrast, particularly if they had kidney function that was already compromised, right? So one thing that you would do is you would really hydrate these people, right? You'd give them lots of fluids during the procedure, prior to the procedure, during the procedure, after the procedure, to flush that contrast out, if you will. The other thing that you would do is you would basically use as little contrast as possible. And so I actually got to the point where I developed some techniques where we could do a cardiac catheterization. Instead of using 120 cc's of contrast, we could do it with about 20 cc's.
Whoa.
Yeah.
That's a massive reduction.
It's a massive reduction, right? We had ways to do that by rotating the camera during the shot instead of keeping the camera stationary, where you could get multiple views of an artery in one shot, as opposed to, with maybe 12 cc's of contrast for the left side and maybe 8 cc's for the right side. And you could get the whole anatomy, right? Provided they didn't bypasses and stuff like that you had to go find. But, we developed techniques like that. And then for people that needed a stent, going to surgery to have a bypass done is traumatic for the kidneys also, right? People are being put on heart-lung machines, and there's a lot of oxidative stress, and the kidneys don't fare well, and they can go into failure because of being on the heart-lung machine. So we would put stents in for people to open up arteries, but we got to where we could do, instead of using, say, 200 cc's of contrast to be able to do a stent procedure, we could again do that with 20 cc's of contrast. And that was really unheard of. But we were able to do this safely for so many people. And the way we did it was I would go in and I would take one picture of the artery using a rotational view from the camera. I would have already seen the arteries before, right? They would already had a diagnostic procedure done prior. And then from there, I would go in and I would just hold that image in a fixed position with a fixed angle that I knew correlated to the picture I was seeing. And then I would just basically go in and thread a little wire down the artery. Even though I couldn't keep shooting contrast, I could see the wire go down the artery because the wire also would show up under X-ray, right? And then I could bring in an intracoronary ultrasound catheter. So now I could actually look at the artery from the inside out, right? Imagine that you could go inside of your garden hose and you had the ability to look not downstream or upstream, but you had the ability to look out through the sidewalls, right? And you could look around and you could tell that you were in the lumen, you were in the opening of the hose. And so you'd keep going down and you keep looking around until you got to where the blockage was, because you could see the blockage that way, right? It'd be like, okay, well, then you take a picture of where the ultrasound catheter was at the beginning of the blockage. You'd keep passing it downstream until you got to the end of the blockage, just take a picture there. So now you had those two pictures. You haven't used any contrast. You just have pictures. Now you go in and you put a stent in and you cover it, those two areas. Then you inflate it completely. Then you go back with the ultrasound and make sure it's fully deployed, that the artery is fully open, that there are no tears and everything looks good. Then you take one final picture. So with 20 cc's, you've actually done what normally would take like 200 cc's. So, yeah. Anyway, so the point is, if you have kidney disease and you need to have things done, there are safe ways to do it, but you don't want to be doing CT angiograms, which, they just have to give you a bolus of contrast. And you don't want to be doing MRIs with contrast because that can damage your kidneys. So you have to be careful with imaging procedures, is the point I'm making. But if you work with a physician that has the ability to do things like the way that we used to do them, you can still have things done. It just has to be done with special precautions. So.
Well, there was an article that Leo sent us about.
Let me interrupt you before you get to that article, because I'll just say this. One of the things that I always wanted to do as I was leaving cardiology was to do a study looking at molecular hydrogen, because I think hydrogen, decreases reperfusion injury in the heart. What is that? Well, it's if you block off a heart artery from a heart attack. Let's say your artery is closed because you're having a heart attack, and we go up in and open it up again. That's great, but now blood's flowing into tissue that wasn't getting oxygen for some number of minutes, and it's vulnerable to that oxygen coming in. And actually, the newly arriving oxygen perpetuates the damage of the total occlusion because the tissue can no longer handle the oxygen the way it used to, right?
Wow.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
So with the kidneys, I always felt like if somebody has vulnerable kidneys, if they were taking hydrogen, which decreases oxidative stress, right, that we could help protect their kidneys if we just gave them our inhaled hydrogen or even hydrogen water through an IV or something like this, right? We never got a chance to try that, but I think it could be helpful. So my point to the audience is, if you're thinking about having a procedure done and you're worried about your kidneys, I would drink hydrogen before you go into it. I think you'd find it would be helpful.
This episode of the Gladden Longevity Podcast is brought to you by the new Gladden Longevity Anti-Inflammatory Shroom Formula.
A little background. Our anti-inflammatory formula is a potent blend of adaptogenic mushrooms specifically designed to support your body's natural defense mechanisms to reduce inflammation. This unique formula contains a powerful mix of medicinal mushrooms, including agaricus, reishi, cordyceps, and maitake, known for their immune boosting and anti-inflammatory properties. Together, they do a great job of turning down a major driver of inflammation.
I've been a big fan of adaptogenic mushrooms for a number of years now, and I was really excited to find you all were coming out with this. This is a superior product to what I've tested on the market.
Yeah, we love it, and our clients love it as well. Again, this is a tincture, so we will put it in tea, we'll put it in a smoothie, we'll put it in water and drink it. But to know that you're actually able to decrease NF-kappa beta, which is a major driver of inflammation in your body with this, it just goes along with everything else that we know about aging, that inflammation is a key driver of the aging process. So we love going straight at the heart of it with this formula.
Get 10% off your order of the new Gladden Longevity Anti-Inflammatory Shroom Formula when you use the code podcast10 at gladdenlongevitysshop.com. That's podcast10 at checkout when you visit gladdenlongevitysshop.com.
Experience the power of adaptogenic mushrooms with our anti-inflammatory formula and embrace a healthier, more balanced lifestyle.
So there was this article from Sheffield Teaching Hospitals about, here's the title, Artificial Intelligence Tool Predicts Kidney Failure 6 times faster than Human Expert Analysis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What were your thoughts?
So there have been many of these done now, different algorithms, right, to basically predict. And typically what they're trying to do is predict who's at risk for going into kidney failure if we do cardiac surgery, if we do gallbladder surgery, if we do a heart catheterization, if we do a a CT angiogram. Who's at risk, right, of going into kidney failure? And what they found is there are a lot of different markers when you go through, proteomics and metabolomics that you can use machine learning to pull out, well, these markers actually turn out to be predictive. It's really predictive by association. It's not necessarily causality, right? It's not like temp is actually causing it, but you can find that if that's elevated, then there's an increased risk for this person, right? And so these algorithms are helpful. I'm glad that medicine is using them because, you want to protect the kidneys, right?
Yeah. So where does saunas fit in terms of, are they good for your kidneys? Are they bad for you? Is it not really an issue in that whole detox process?
Yeah, well, it's a great question because, you really have three ways to get junk out of your body, right? Well, yeah, three ways. You get it out through the liver and then out through the stool, right? That's one pathway. You get it out through the kidneys or you get it out through your skin. That's pretty much it. I suppose the lung actually exhales some gases, right? So there's some exhalation of vapors and things like that, things that are aromatic, let's say, you can get out through the lungs. So maybe there's four really. But the kidneys and the liver are kind of the major players for the most part. Now, you can make the skin a major player by sweating, right? So, vigorous exercise to the point where you're sweating is really good. Saunas, where you're also sweating, is a great way to detox. And the beauty of that is if you have an issue with your kidneys, you don't want to be pushing heavy metals out through your kidneys. You don't want to be chelating heavy metals and pushing all those metals out through your kidneys. That's a really big load on the kidney, and it can lead to more kidney problems and kidney damage. You'd rather get them out with a sauna. So many times people will go for chelation to take out things, but just understand that the chelated metal or whatever else is being pulled out has to go out through the kidneys, and that's a risk. So what we prefer is to actually use saunas and then use some binders in the gut to help pull things out through the gut so that you can do a combination of that. And with that, we've been able to get, lead out of people and mercury out of people and all kinds of stuff without having to expose the kidney to that risk, right? And I'm kind of sensitive to that myself because I don't want to damage my own kidneys. So we've kind of adopted that for our clients, and it's worked out remarkably well.
So kidney health, just take care of it. Right?
Yeah, you got to take care of it. Eat the right things, avoid too much salt, too much potassium, too much phosphorus if your kidneys are an issue. Avoid too much protein. Think about perfect aminos, think about hydrogen. And then you got to take care of your blood vessels, right? Because the kidneys and the blood vessels are interlinked. So all the things that we do to take care of the glycocalyx, right? Like arterosil and Vasconox and a high nitrate diet and some of the other supplements like Vinia that, improves nitric oxide production. We did a whole podcast with Nathan Bryan about nitric oxide producing supplements, right?
And Gladden Longevity's blood vessel formula.
Yeah, and Gladden Longevity's blood vessel formula, exactly, is focused on decreasing the oxidative stress in the arteries. So all of those things together, if you have bad kidneys, what you want to do is take care of your blood vessels, right? And then there are some supplements that we use to take care of the kidneys too. And some of what we've really kind of gone down to is some of the Chinese herbs.
Really?
Yeah. So there are Chinese herbs out there that work really, really good. This Li Zai Hai is a good one. And then we have a kidney DTX. That's basically, it's an amalgamation of Chinese herbs, but the data on these amalgamations of these herbs is actually quite good and they work quite well. So we're big fans of that. And then there's a peptide that we use also called SS31 that's been shown to decrease oxidative stress and improve kidney function for people and decrease proteinuria. Yeah, loss of protein. Yeah, so I use SS31. So
how often do you use that? And how often are you using these Chinese herbs and
daily?
Supplement?
Daily. I use them daily. Mm-hmm.
Really?
I use the Chinese herbs daily. It's part of my regimen. And then I use the SS31 maybe once a week, something like that. But yeah, it's 1 cc. You inject it just below the skin. And so, with these things, I'm about to go in and get some more testing done here in the next couple of weeks. But with these things, I've been able to maintain my kidney function. I think eventually, though, that kidney that's scarred, if we need to regenerate it, we'll be doing some sort of a stem cell, regrowing nephrons, whatever. And that technology is maturing, but I'm not ready to sign up for it just yet. So,
yeah. Well, it is National Kidney Month, but it's also National Nutrition Month. And we have some articles that we wanted to talk about.
Okay.
The first is An article from the Daily Mail, Mediterranean diet may reduce brain age, study suggests.
Yep.
And it's in parentheses, but you'll need to have plenty of green tea and walnuts.
Okay, so they're looking for omega-3s and EGCG. I mean, EGCG is really kind of the main ingredient in green tea, right? So the interesting thing about food and nutrients is that we tend to think of food and nutrients as being biochemically active or being a source of energy or modulating a pathway. But what's really important to understand is that foods like this, like, omega-3s and EGCG and many other things that we use, sulforaphane and resveratrol, et cetera, they're actually modulating genetic expression, right? So they go into the nucleus of the cell. Vitamin D is like this, right? It's not really a vitamin, it's more of a hormone. It goes in and it modulates genetic expression. If you're going to be a carnivore, it's like, I'm on a carnivore diet, man. I eat nothing but meat all the time. And then I throw in some, a baked potato every now and then. Think of all the nutrients that your body is missing with that diet, right? I mean, the plants have so many nutrients for us, and it's not about eating the same plants all the time. And even if you have kidney issues, it doesn't mean you can never eat an orange or you can never have a, sardine. It just means that you want to be rotating through stuff. Your body loves variety, and it loves that variety. And then there are some things that are just so incredibly good, right? Like resveratrol, like Piceid resveratrol from Vinia, or Abmacol Extra that has sulforaphane with myronase to activate the sulforaphane to make it even more potent. Things like that are modulating your DNA expression. So when I think about nutrients, I tend to think about it from starting at the DNA. Okay, what are these nutrients doing to the expression of my genes, right? And as the audience listens to this is where you should start to think, okay, what is this saturated fat doing to activate or deactivate my genes, right? So if you have a 9p21 gene for heart disease and you're eating saturated fat, well, you're just activating inflammation for yourself. Or if you have a STAT3 gene, you're actually just saturated fats are just putting on belly fat for you, right? So you have to know your genetics, and you have to know how your nutrients are interfacing with your genes to actually end up picking the right diet. And then you got to know your immune system, how you're reacting to foods, what your gut health is, et cetera. So I have a real beef with people that have a diet that they think is for everybody. It's not true, right? It's like, I've got a shirt that's for everybody. Well, actually, it's not going to fit everybody, right? So, yeah.
Yeah. There's also an article from North Dakota State University. The title is Practice Mindful Eating in March, National Nutrition Month. Mm-hmm. And the gist of the article is that there's mindless eating and there's mindful eating. And one of the things they say is eating while you work can lead to mindless eating, which people tend to eat more during that mindless eating.
Yep. No, that's exactly right. I mean, I've noticed that myself, right? I think Leo was pointing out in an email chain that I work a lot while I'm eating, right? Because I don't usually take a lunch break. I don't know. I started that really young in life as a teenager. Like, I was working, and, some of the people I was working with, like, we were doing like manual labor. Like, I worked at a nursery, weeding gardens and then planting trees and stuff like that. Then I got into painting houses, and people would take a lunch break, and I'd be like, oh man, I can eat the sandwich in 5 minutes and I can get back to work and get more done, right? So I kind of got away from taking lunch breaks. But I have noticed that if I set down a bowl of something next to me, right, I will mindlessly eat through a lot more than I would if I actually sat down to eat something and then got up from that. So I think there's a lot of truth to that you need to be mindful about it. If you're working or you're distracted by something, I think the same thing is true for watching TV. People sit down and watch TV, and the next thing you know, they've eaten a whole bowl of popcorn, right? Where they wouldn't actually sit down at a table and eat a whole bowl of popcorn, right? So,
well, one of the things they said in here is that our brains do not multitask very well, according to neuropsychologists. The majority of people can focus on one thing at a time. Mm-hmm. Less than 3% of people can multitask, according to research. And so, how is this mindless eating affecting that caloric intake?
It's increasing it, right? It's increasing it. And you're probably increasing the kind of calories that you don't want. You're probably not sitting down and, mindlessly eating a steak or a hamburger, right? It's not like you went from eating one hamburger to 3 hamburgers, or you went from eating one piece of chicken to half a chicken, right? What usually happens is it's more like you've got a bowl of grapes, or you've got some crackers, or you have some chips, or you have some popcorn, or you have, something in that category, right? Or a bowl of ice cream. It's like, you'll eat the first bowl, but then it's like, oh, I'm still watching this, I'm going to eat another bowl, right? Whereas
or they take the whole pint and they're watching TV and they're just eating it.
Exactly. Or it's like, there's a pie over there, I think I'll have a piece, but then it's like, I'm still watching it, I think I'll have another piece, right? So you just you're distracted, to your point, by whatever else you're doing or watching, and you lose track of the fact that you're overeating. I think that's the real risk, is you overeat too many calories, and too many of the wrong calories, right? So
March, National Kidney Month and National Nutrition Month. Dr. Gladden, any final thoughts for our listeners?
I don't know. What'd you have to eat today?
I haven't eaten yet.
Okay, well, there you go. So let's talk about that. So intermittent fasting, we've talked about this before. There was an article written, we even talked about this on a podcast with a woman that has a podcast dedicated to intermittent fasting. And she eats 1 meal a day in the evening, a big meal. And we showed this article to her. I actually sent it to her. I emailed it to her after the podcast, because it shows that if you eat one big meal a day, you have an 80% increased risk of dying sooner and an 80% increased risk of heart disease. And so when you think about nutrition, the body likes to be fed, but it likes to be fed in small quantities, right? Because eating is not necessarily restorative. It can be actually very taxing on the body. It can be a big stress on the body. So knowing that, I used to, see how long I could go, but now I don't. Now I go until I feel like, oh, I could eat something, and then I eat something, right? But I don't eat a big something. I just eat something. And then I go until I feel like I need to eat something, and then I eat something more, but it's still not a big something, right? And so I may, have a 6-8 hour window that I'm eating food in, but I'm never eating a lot of food all at once. And I think that's the key. Right. And I've found that if I put myself in a situation where there's mindless eating potential, I will overeat. And so I have to control that. So
This morning, instead of just getting up, going to the climbing gym, getting home and immediately jumping on a call with my team, what I should have done probably is grab a fast bar or have a little protein shake, something like that, to get something in my system.
Yeah. Or take some perfect aminos, take 5 or 6 perfect amino tablets. Or I'll tell you what's become one of my favorites is some spirulina chlorella. Thor's Hammer, and there are other brands out there, but spirulina chlorella is amazing for detox. It's amazing. Like if we were stuck in an elevator for a month and all we had was spirulina and chlorella tablets, we'd probably walk off the elevator at the end of the month and be pretty much okay. They're so nutrient dense. They have protein. They have so many good phytonutrients in them, and they naturally detox you. They're good fiber. They're good.
Really?
They're amazing. So anyway, what I did this morning was I got up, I did my usual journaling and meditation, took my thyroid, allowed that to digest. And then the surf is up here in Puerto Rico. So I went out to body surf and I went out and body surfed and I caught a couple nice waves and I came back. And then I had some of the perfect aminos. And then I let those go for about 30 minutes. Then I had a handful, I don't know how many tabs it was, maybe 15 of the spirulina and chlorella, and ate that. And then, I don't know, an hour or two later, I actually scrambled some eggs and made some eggs and had some basil with it. And, I'm planning to drink some smoothie that I made yesterday that's in the refrigerator, and that'll probably finish out the day for me, right? So that's kind of how I'm doing it, yeah.
I've never heard you talk about spirulina chlorella.
No, you haven't heard me talk about it, so I've been holding out on you.
What else are you holding out on me with?
We don't have enough time for all that.
Well, I just looked it up on Amazon, and I'm definitely going to be adding some of this to my regimen.
Yeah,
So
we'll do a podcast on it. So,
all right, well, let's talk about it in our next Q&A next month.
Yeah. Okay.
All right, Dr. Gladden, thanks for doing this. I know our listeners appreciate it. And listeners, if you have a question for us, for Dr. Gladden, be sure to email us podcast@gladdenlongevity.com. That's podcast@gladdenlongevity.com. There'll also be a link in the show notes. And submit your question. We love hearing these questions. I think in the last time we did this, there were 2 or 3 questions I think that we answered during that, or Dr. Gladden answered, I read. And so we love hearing from you, listeners.
Yeah, it's great. It's fun. We love the interaction with you guys. We love your feedback. We love your questions. We like this to be conversational, really. It's a podcast, but it should be called a pod conversation. So think of it in a conversational light.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Gladden Longevity Podcast. If you would like more information on what we've discussed or other topics, please reference the show notes or go to GladdenLongevityPodcast.com. You can also find us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter by searching Gladden Longevity. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to get future episodes delivered to you and share our podcast or this episode with someone in your life that may find benefit. Thank you for listening. We'll be back next week with another exciting episode. The Gladden Longevity Podcast is provided for informational purposes only. It does not constitute medical advice. This content is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of a physician or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. The use of any information and materials linked to this podcast is at the listener's own risk.